I am Millie Davis, 34 years old, a United States Army officer. Last Tuesday, I stood at attention in the hallway of a law office in Harlan, Washington. Through the thick oak door, I could clearly hear the voice of Vivian, my stepmother, loudly declaring that this will reading was only for named heirs. It was followed by a scoffing laugh from Derek, her son. In my hand was a thin file. It was so thin it could slide through a crack in the door, but its weight was enough to level 16 years of lies. What Vivian didn't expect was that my father's final call on his deathbed wasn't to her, nor to her children, but to a woman Vivian had never heard of. Before I take you back to where it all began, take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. And if you're watching right now, let me know your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Now, let me take you back to Harlan, Washington, in the fall of the year I was 14. And the night my mother's hospital room went silent. The sound didn't scream. It didn't explode. It was a single, piercing beep that sliced the hospital room in half. A flat, neon green line ran across the monitor like a razor blade. I stood at the foot of the bed, feet shoulder-width apart, back straight. 14 years old and already learning how to turn into stone. Grace, my mother, was gone. The hand I held was still warm, but the life was retreating, fleeing from the wreckage of 11 months of chemotherapy. Cancer hadn't just sickened her, it had bombarded her. It was heavy artillery fire that leveled her defenses until there was nothing left but skin stretched over bone. I didn't cry. Soldiers in waiting don't have that luxury. I just watched the nurse, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that said Helen, reach over and silence the machine. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. 3 days ago, the room hadn't been this quiet. My mother had used the last of her strength to haul me close. Her fingers dug into my forearm, her grip like iron wire. "Remember, Millie," she'd whispered. Her breath smelled like metallic rot and copper. "That house on the hill. It belongs to you. Not the walls, not the lumber, but the things your father built inside." She wasn't being sentimental. She was giving me a briefing, a tactical objective. "Don't let them take the coordinates, Millie. Promise me." I didn't understand them back then. I didn't know who the enemy was. I just nodded because a soldier follows orders. I looked across the room at the man who was supposed to be the commander. My father, Richard Townsend. He wasn't standing. He wasn't taking charge. He was hunched over in a vinyl chair in the corner, his face buried in his palms. His shoulders shook. The sound coming from him was a wet, ragged whimpering. It was the sound of a man who had completely abandoned his post. Richard was a real estate man, the best in the county. He didn't just sell houses, he sold the American dream. He could walk into a gutted foreclosure and make a couple see a nursery and a white picket fence. He sold warmth. He sold security. But here, in the cold fluorescent light of Ward 4, he couldn't sell himself a reason to stand up. Our house on Miller Hill had been a fortress. I remember the smell of it before the bleach moved in. It smelled like lavender and old sheet music. My mother would sit at the upright piano for hours, filling the hallways with something that felt like safety. We had an acre of land and a view of the valley that made you feel like you owned the world. That was the home Richard built. And that night, as the doctor pulled a white sheet over my mother's face, I watched my father crumble into the floorboards. "Richard," the doctor said softly. My father didn't look up. He didn't even acknowledge the man. He just kept shaking. I walked over to him. I wanted him to pull me into his arms. I wanted him to tell me that the perimeter was still secure, that we'd hold the line together. Instead, when I put my hand on his shoulder, he flinched. He pulled away as if my touch was an electric shock. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. He was a realtor who had just lost his only meaningful piece of property, and he had no idea how to close the deal on his own life. That night, I thought death was the worst thing that could happen. I thought the end of the beep was the final blow. I was wrong. The real disaster wasn't the flatline. The disaster was the vacuum left behind. My father had left the gates wide open. He had vacated the command center, leaving the sensors dark and the guards asleep. He didn't know it yet, but the invasion was already scheduled. The woman who would eventually strip the lavender from the garden and the music from the halls was already out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting for a weak man to let his guard down. I looked at my mother's covered form. Then I looked at my broken father. I stood straighter. I smoothed out my t-shirt. I didn't have a uniform yet, but I was already beginning to build one out of ice. "Millie, honey, we should go," my father finally choked out, not looking at the bed, not looking at me. He walked out of the room first. He didn't hold the door. He didn't wait. He just shuffled down the hallway, a ghost of a man looking for a place to hide. I stayed for one more second. I touched the cold wood of the bed frame. Target locked, Mom, I thought. 18 months later, Vivian Marsh walked through our front door with a tray of lasagna and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. By the time I realized she was the enemy, she had already occupied the master bedroom. 18 months. That is how long the perimeter held before the breach. Vivian Marsh didn't arrive with sirens or a battering ram. She arrived in a taupe minivan with a batch of lukewarm lasagna and a smile that looked like it had been manufactured in a factory with poor quality control. She called it neighborly spirit. I saw it for what it was, a reconnaissance mission. Behind her stood Derek, 16, built like a brick wall with a sneer that promised trouble, and Paige, a silent 12-year-old who looked like she was counting the seconds until she could disappear. They weren't moving in to be a family. They were an occupying force. The first strike happened at the garden, my mother's lavender. Those purple rows were the only things left that still carried her scent. On a Tuesday morning, I heard the sound. Snip, fap, snip. I walked out to the porch. Vivian was hunched over the bushes, heavy-duty garden shears in her hands. She was hacking them down to the dirt. The air was thick with the smell of crushed stems, the smell of my mother being murdered a second time. "What are you doing?" I asked. My voice was flat, controlled. Vivian didn't look up. She kept cutting. "Allergies, Millie. Derek's eyes get all puffy with these around. We need a clean slate, something manageable, maybe some gravel and a few hardy shrubs." I looked at the garage. My father was there, tinkering with a lawnmower that wasn't broken. He heard me. He saw the purple heaps on the grass. He just tightened a bolt that was already tight and stared at the oil stains on the concrete. He had surrendered the garden without a single shot fired. By the end of the week, the clean slate had moved inside. The lace curtains in the parlor, the ones my mother had picked out in Spokane, were gone, replaced by heavy gray drapes that blocked the sun. The upright piano, the one that used to fill the house with Chopin, was pushed into a corner of the dining room. It became a shelf for Vivian's ceramic chickens. Derek claimed the piano room. He brought in a beanbag chair and a television that roared with the sound of gunshots and engines from his Xbox. One afternoon, I sat down at the keys. I struck a single middle C. The note was pure. It was a memory. Before the sound could even fade, the television volume surged. A wall of artificial noise slammed into my back. Vivian walked through, holding a pile of laundry. She didn't look at me. She didn't say a word. She just adjusted a picture frame on the wall and kept walking. That was her primary weapon. Total erasure. If she didn't acknowledge you, you didn't exist. You were just furniture that hadn't been sold yet. The annexation of my life reached its peak on a Friday night. I was in my room, my sanctuary, reading a manual on engine repair. The door opened without a knock. Vivian stood there. She didn't come in. She just leaned against the frame, wiping her hands on a floral apron. "Millie, honey, we've been talking about space, about privacy." I sat up. I felt the hair on my neck rise. "Derek is a growing boy," she continued. Her voice was sweet, like rotting fruit. "He needs a room that fits his energy. And you're nearly 16. A young woman needs her own separate quarters, a place where you won't be bothered by the boys. This is my room, I said. The basement is finished, she said, ignoring my statement. We've put down some nice rugs. It's cool, quiet. Your father thinks it's a great way for you to have your own suite. I looked past her. Richard was standing at the end of the hallway, near the linen closet. He was looking at his shoes. Dad? He didn't look up. He cleared his throat, a dry, pathetic sound. It's just for a while, Millie, until we figure things out. It's more practical this way. He didn't meet my eyes. He turned and walked toward the kitchen, his back hunched, retreating into the smell of the pot roast Vivian had made to soften the blow. That night, I moved. I didn't cry. I carried my mattress down the narrow, creaking stairs. I dragged my box of books into the dark. The basement smelled of damp concrete, old furnace oil, and defeat. My suite was a corner next to the water heater, shielded by a moth-eaten curtain. At dinner, the shift was complete. I was pushed to the far end of the table, near the drafty back door. I sat there in silence, watching them pass the mashed potatoes. Derek was laughing, talking about some kid he'd shoved in the locker room. Vivian was beaming at him. My father was eating, staring at his plate as if the answers to his cowardice were written in the gravy. I was a ghost in my own house, a prisoner in the cellar. When the lights went out, I lay on that thin mattress on the concrete floor. The silence was absolute except for the ceiling. Creak, pop, scrape. Derek was walking around in my room, directly above my head. I could hear the heavy thud of his boots. I could hear him drop his bag. Every step was a reminder. Every vibration was a boot on my neck. I laid there, eyes wide open in the dark, counting the thuds. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a casualty of a war I hadn't realized was being fought. I know some of you listening right now have been there. You've stood in a room that used to be yours and realized you're suddenly the outsider. If you've ever felt the sting of being replaced by someone who didn't earn your spot, hit that like button right now. It helps me know I'm not the only one who had to learn to survive the shadows. And do me a favor, drop a comment with the word fortress if you've ever had to build your own walls just to keep your soul intact. I read every single one of them. The water heater groaned next to me, a low, mechanical growl. Above, the footsteps stopped right over my face. Derek jumped. The floorboard shrieked. Dust drifted down from the rafters, settling on my lips. I didn't wipe it off. I tasted the grit. I tasted the house as it was being eaten from the inside out. I looked at the dark stairs. I knew then that I couldn't stay in the cellar forever. I needed a way out. I needed a uniform. I needed a life where the footsteps above me belonged to people I could actually fight back against. The decision didn't come in a flash of light. It came in the rhythm of Derek's boots. Creak, pop, creak. I started counting the days until I was 18. The night I graduated from Harlan High, the air smelled like cheap charcoal briquettes and domestic betrayal. Vivian had spent weeks planning the party. She bought streamers in Derek's school colors, even though he'd barely scraped by with C-minis, and rented a massive keg that sat sweating on a hay bale in the backyard. She invited the neighbors, the PTA mothers she'd charmed, and every one of Derek's loud-mouthed buddies. I stood on the back porch, my graduation gown still zipped up, feeling like a plastic mannequin in a house I used to own. No one had invited my friends. No one had asked if I wanted a cake. My father was at the grill, flipping burgers with a forced grin, acting like the happy patriarch in a play where I was just an uncredited extra. I watched Derek's friends, a pack of oversized boys with muddy boots, stumbling across the patch of dirt where my mother's lavender had once thrived. They were spilling beer on the ground, laughing as they kicked the gravel Vivian had laid down to bury the past. That's when it hit me. Holding a position where the commander had already raised the white flag wasn't bravery. It was suicide. I went downstairs, not to the party, but to the cellar. The dampness of the concrete floor felt more honest than the noise upstairs. I pulled out the suitcase I'd bought with saved babysitting money, a cheap, 26-inch nylon thing with wheels that squeaked. Packing didn't take long. When you're invisible, you don't accumulate much mass. My life fit into that bag with room to spare. 3 pairs of jeans, a few flannels, my mother's old sheet music, and a high school diploma that felt like a ticket out of hell. I folded every shirt into a perfect, tight square. Sharp edges. No wrinkles. Even then, I was trying to find an order that my father had let rot. The house groaned as the party shifted into the late-night phase. Bass from Derek's speakers vibrated through the floorboards, shaking dust into my hair. I waited. I sat on the edge of my mattress next to the water heater and watched the red numbers of my digital clock. 4 a.m. The house finally went quiet. The smell of stale beer and cigarettes had seeped through the vents. I carried the suitcase up the stairs, avoiding the third step that always squeaked. I walked into the kitchen. My father was passed out in his recliner, an empty Budweiser can resting on his chest. He looked small, defeated. I didn't wake him. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been buried 18 months ago. I took a scrap of paper from the counter and wrote 7 words. I can't stay where I don't belong. I placed the note on his pillow. I didn't cry. Tears are for people who still think someone is coming to save them. I grabbed the handle of my suitcase and walked out the front door. The nylon wheels ritted against the cold asphalt of the driveway, a harsh, rhythmic sound that echoed through the sleeping neighborhood. I didn't look back at the house on Miller Hill. I just kept walking until I reached the Greyhound station on the edge of town. The 5 a.m. bus to Seattle was nearly empty. It smelled of diesel fumes and floor wax. I sat by the window, watching the town of Harlan dissolve into a gray blur of pine trees and rain. By noon, I was standing in front of a storefront office with a faded U.S. Army sign in the window. The recruiter, a sergeant with skin like old leather, looked at my suitcase and then at my eyes. He didn't ask about my graduation party. He just handed me a pen. "You sure about this, kid?" he asked. "It ain't like the movies." "I'm sure," I said. The next 16 years were a blur of grit and steel. I traded the damp cellar for sand-blasted barracks and freezing foxholes. I learned that pain was just data and that a clear chain of command was the only thing that kept the world from spinning into chaos. I rose through the ranks. Lieutenant, captain, major. My officer's pay didn't go toward fancy cars or vacations. It went into a high-yield savings account, a war chest I was building while the rest of the world slept. I tried to call home, in the beginning anyway. Vivian always answered. Her voice was a wall of polite ice. "Your father is resting, Millie. Your father is busy with Derek's new business. Maybe call back next month." Slowly, his voice faded from my life. He became a ghost I used to know, a man who had traded his daughter for the quiet of a house run by a tyrant. I stopped calling. I focused on the mission. I hardened myself until I was nothing but military-grade brass and scar tissue. Then came this past March. I was in my office in Seattle, reviewing supply manifests, when my personal cell phone buzzed. An unknown Harlan area code. I picked up. I didn't say hello. I just waited. "Millie," Vivian's voice came through, colder than I remembered. There was no honey this time, no fake warmth, just the flat reporting of a casualty. "Your father is gone, heart failure. The funeral is Saturday." The line went dead before I could breathe. I sat there for a long time, staring at the rain hitting the window. 16 years of exile. 16 years of being a soldier for a country that didn't know my name, while my own home was occupied by scavengers. I stood up. I folded my current paperwork into a perfect, square pile. I walked to my locker and pulled out my dress blues. I brushed a microscopic speck of dust from the shoulder board. The exile was over. The commander was dead, but the major was coming home to reclaim the fortress. I packed my bag, the same 26-inch nylon suitcase, now battered and covered in travel stickers. I didn't need much, just my uniform, my steel, and the thin file I'd been quietly compiling for over a decade. Vivian thought she had won because the house was silent. She forgot that I was the one she'd trained to survive in the dark. The 3.5-hour drive from Seattle to Harlan felt like a slow crawl through a graveyard of memories. I kept the heater in the rental Nissan cranked to high, but the cold stayed in my marrow. Outside, the evergreen trees turned into jagged silhouettes against a bruised, gray sky. By the time I crossed the town line, the rain had turned into a steady, freezing mist. Harlan hadn't changed. It was still a town held together by rusted iron and stubborn silence. I drove past the diner where the neon sign still flickered with a dying buzz, then pulled into the gravel lot of the Church of the Holy Cross. I sat in the car for exactly 2 minutes. I checked my reflection in the visor mirror. My dress blues were perfect. Every ribbon was aligned. Every brass button shone like a threat. My hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it pulled at my scalp. I didn't need a hug. I needed armor. I stepped out. The gravel crunched under my polished heels, a sharp rhythmic sound that announced my arrival. Inside, the church smelled of floor wax, wet wool, and old, damp pine. It was a suffocating scent. I paused at the heavy oak doors, my eyes sweeping the room like a tactical sensor. I wasn't looking for comfort. I was assessing the terrain. Enemy position. Front left pew. Vivian was draped in black lace, a veil obscuring her face, though I could see her clutching a silk handkerchief. Next to her sat Derek, his shoulders bursting out of a suit that looked too expensive for a man without a job. Paige sat on his other side, her head bowed so low her chin touched her chest. They looked like a portrait of grief. It was a lie so well crafted it made my skin crawl. The rest of the pews were filled with the people of Harlan, shopkeepers, old neighbors, people who had watched me grow up and then watched me disappear. As I walked down the center aisle, the pews began to creak. Necks craned. Whispers hissed like steam from a broken pipe. Is that her? The one who left? Look at the uniform. Thinks she's better than us. I ignored them. I kept my eyes fixed on the mahogany casket at the front. I needed to see him. I needed to see the man who had let our world burn. I reached the third row. My boots were 6 feet from the front pew when the wall moved. Derek stood up. He didn't move like a mourner. He moved like a bouncer. He stepped into the aisle, his massive frame blocking my path. He smelled of cheap cologne and tobacco. That's far enough, he said. His voice was a low growl, intended to stay below the organ music. I looked him in the eye. I didn't flinch. Step aside, Derek. I'm going to see my father. Family only up here, Millie, he said, a cruel smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Heirs only. Vivian's orders. You're just a guest now. Go find a seat in the back with the rest of the tourists. I looked past him. Vivian didn't turn around. She didn't move an inch. She just sat there, a black-clad statue of authority. In the field, if a man blocks your path, you have protocols. You neutralize the threat. But here, in a room full of Harlan's finest gossips, the rules were different. To fight him would be to give them the show they wanted. It would be a surrender. I am his daughter, I said. My voice was ice. You were a ghost for 16 years, Derek hissed. You don't get to play the mourning child now. Move, or I'll have the sheriff escort a disturbed veteran out of the building. The silence from the pews was absolute. No one stood up for me. No one called out the injustice. In the army, if you're under fire, your squad pulls you back. Here, I was alone in a room full of people who shared my history, but none of my blood. I took one step back, then another. I didn't lower my head. I maintained my posture, shoulders back, chin level. I retreated to the very last row. I stood near the back door, next to the radiator that clanked with every pulse of heat. I didn't sit. I stood at attention. I measured the distance with my eyes. 6 meters. That was the gap between me and my father. 6 meters of polished wood and bitter air. It was the physical manifestation of every birthday he missed, every letter he didn't write, and every time he let Vivian win. The service was a blur of platitudes. The preacher talked about Richard Townsend, the pillar of the community. He didn't mention the man who hid in his recliner while his daughter was exiled to a cellar. I didn't cry. I didn't blink. I focused on the back of Vivian's head, analyzing the way she leaned into Derek. She was consolidating power. She was the queen of a tiny, rotting kingdom. When it was over, the pews emptied. People shuffled past me, avoiding eye contact as if my uniform might stain them. I walked out into the biting wind of the parking lot. I was leaning against my rental, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers when I saw her. An older woman with silver hair and a worn wool coat. Helen Briggs, the nurse from Chapter 1. She was standing by a rusted Ford F-15. Oh, she didn't approach me. She just caught my eye and gave a single, sharp nod. It wasn't a greeting. It was a signal. I see you, the nod said. I know what they did. She got into her truck and drove away, leaving me alone in the mist. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a haptic vibration that felt like a sting. I pulled it out. An email from the office of Garrett and Associates. Subject, Estate of Richard Townsend. Text. Per the instructions of the primary beneficiary, Vivian Townsend, you are hereby notified that the reading of the last will and testament is scheduled for tomorrow at 0900. Your presence is not required as you are not listed as a named heir. Any attempt to enter the premises will be considered trespassing. I stared at the screen until the light dimmed. They had locked the gates. They had fortified the position. I crushed the cigarette out under my heel. I looked at the church, then at the road leading to the only motel in town. Vivian thought she had the only map to my father's life. She thought the named heirs were the only ones with a key. She forgot that I'd spent 16 years learning how to bypass locks. The major was staying in Harlan. And tomorrow morning, I was going to crash their party with a weapon they never saw coming. 9:47 p.m. The rain was drumming against the roof of the rental Nissan like 1,000 dull needles. I sat in the dark of a gas station parking lot off Route 16, the neon open sign casting a rhythmic, sickly red glow over my hands. I'd been staring at the same lukewarm cup of black coffee for 20 minutes. It tasted like burnt beans and old copper. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. The screen lit up the interior with a harsh, white glare. Helen Briggs. I didn't say hello. I just pressed the phone to my ear and waited for the frequency to clear. Major, she said. Her voice was thin, tired, filtered through the static of a cheap burner phone. I'm at the station. I've only got a minute before the shift change. Report, I said. My voice was a flat line. They kept him in a fog, Millie, she whispered. I could hear the frantic clicking of a computer keyboard in the background. Vivian had him on a heavy rotation of sedatives, midazolam, high doses. Every time he'd ask for his phone, every time he'd ask for you, she'd nod to the private nurse she hired, that snake from the agency. And they'd put him back under. He was a prisoner in his own skin. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through my chest. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles went white. Did he leave anything, Helen? Anything physical? He hid it, she said, her voice dropping to a jagged breath. Under the mattress, a photo of you in your basic training uniform. He'd hold it when they weren't looking. Vivian found it 2 weeks before he died. She ripped it up right in front of him. I saw the scraps in the trash, Millie. I couldn't save the picture, but I saved the logs. I closed my eyes. I could see him. Richard, the man who sold dreams, rotting away while a scavenger picked at his vitals. There's more, Helen continued. Last year, when Vivian was in Spokane for 3 days, your father had a moment of clarity. He made me drive him to Bridgewater. He kept saying, Sabrina deserves to know the truth. I didn't know who Sabrina was back then. My mother's middle name, I whispered. He met a lawyer, Margaret Vance. He was terrified, Millie. He knew the clock was running out. I watched him sign the papers with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He had a psychiatrist there to witness it, to prove he was of sound mind before Vivian started the heavy meds. He wasn't just signing a will. He was launching a flare. Send me the coordinates, I said. I already did. Check your encrypted folder. Margaret is waiting for you. Saturday morning, 0800. The line went dead. I sat in the silence of the car, the rain still hammering above me. I looked at the digital clock. The seconds ticked by with mechanical cruelty. I didn't feel sadness. I felt a cold, calculated rage that moved through my veins like liquid nitrogen. Sunday morning, I drove to Bridgewater. The office was a small brick building sandwiched between a hardware store and a laundromat. No mahogany, no oak doors, just a humming fluorescent light and a woman named Margaret who looked like she'd spent 40 years fighting losing battles for people who had nothing left. She didn't offer me tea. She didn't offer condolences. She just slid a manila folder across the scarred wooden desk. He knew you'd come back, Margaret said. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes sharp behind the lenses. He told me you were a soldier. He told me you'd understand a tactical retreat. This is the second will, Major. It was executed 14 months ago. Fully notarized, psychiatrist's affidavit attached. It supersedes anything Vivian holds. I opened the folder. The paper felt heavy. Real. I, Richard Townsend, being of sound mind. My eyes skipped down to the primary clause. To my daughter, Millie Davis, I leave the property known as the Miller Hill Estate in its entirety. I looked at the signature. It was jagged. A mess of ink that looked like a man drowning on dry land. But it was his. There's a note, Margaret added. She handed me a small yellowed envelope. I opened it. The handwriting was cramped, written in a hurry. Millie, it read. I was a coward. I let the fortress fall because I was too tired to fight the shadows. I failed you when I was alive. I won't let you fail now that I'm gone. The house is your armor. Use it. Take back the ground I lost. I'm sorry I was late to the bus. Love, Dad. The bus. The Greyhound station. 16 years later, he finally answered the note I'd left on his pillow. I stood up. My back was a straight line. I folded the documents into the thin file I'd been carrying. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was a magazine, loaded and locked. What are you going to do? Margaret asked. I didn't look back. I just adjusted my coat and stepped out into the biting air of the Washington morning. I'm going to a meeting, I said. I walked to my car. I checked my watch. 8:45. I drove back toward Harlan. I didn't speed. I maintained a steady, deliberate pace. I watched the familiar landmarks pass by. The rusted silos, the pine brakes, the signs for property I used to believe in. I pulled into the lot of Garrett and Associates. The oak door was just ahead. Vivian thought she was reading a will. She thought she was collecting the spoils of a quiet war. She didn't know that the commander had left a sleeper agent behind. I checked the file in my hand. One last time. It was 0900. I pushed the heavy door open. Monday morning, 0900. The hallway of Garrett and Associates smelled like floor wax and old, expensive cigars. The kind of scent that's supposed to make you feel small, like you're trespassing on someone else's success. I stood there for 3 seconds, centering my weight, feeling the familiar pull of my dress blue jacket across my shoulders. I didn't knock. I pushed the heavy oak door open. The sound of the latch clicking into place was loud in the sudden silence of the room. Vivian was sitting in a high-backed leather chair, her fingers laced over a designer handbag. She looked like she was presiding over a royal court. Derek was leaning against the window, picking at a hangnail, looking bored until he saw me. His sneer was instantaneous. I thought the email was clear, Millie. This isn't your place. You're trespassing. I didn't look at him. I didn't look at Vivian either, though I could smell her perfume, something floral and cloying that hit my nose like a physical slap. I walked straight to the long conference table. My heels didn't click. They thudded with purpose. Garrett, a man with skin like parchment and eyes that only saw billable hours, looked up from a stack of papers. He adjusted his glasses, his expression shifting from annoyance to a practiced, patronizing pity. Major Davis, as I informed you, the reading is for named heirs. Perhaps we can schedule a brief talk later this week. The reading starts now, I said. My voice was low. The kind of low that makes people stop breathing just to hear the end of the sentence. I didn't wait for a response. I reached into my bag and pulled out the manila folder Margaret Vance had given me. I didn't hand it to him. I dropped it. Slap. The sound of the folder hitting the oak table was dry and final. It sounded like a gunshot in a library. I'm not here to argue, Garrett, I said, maintaining the breathing of a sniper, slow, deep, rhythmic. I'm here to provide the actual coordinates. Open it. Derek laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. What's that? A list of your grievances, or maybe a bill for 16 years of being a ghost. I ignored the noise. I watched Garrett. He hesitated, then reached out and flipped the folder open. I saw his eyes track the first page, then the second. I watched the muscle in his jaw clench. He stopped breathing for a second. This? Garrett started, his voice losing its edge. This is a notarized will. Executed 14 months ago. The room went cold. I could see the dust motes dancing in a sliver of morning light, frozen. Vivian leaned forward, her knuckles white as they gripped the arms of her chair. What are you talking about, Arthur? That's impossible. Richard he wasn't himself last year. He was confused. The folder contains a sanity affidavit from a board-certified psychiatrist, Vivian, I said. I looked at her then. I saw the crack in her foundation, the tiny tremor in her lower lip that she couldn't hide with all the expensive lipstick in Washington. And a sworn statement from Nurse Helen Briggs regarding the confusion you were manufacturing with high-dose sedatives. Garrett cleared his throat. He looked at Vivian, and for the first time, there was no pity in his eyes. There was only the calculated fear of a man realizing he was on the wrong side of a landslide. Mrs. Townsend, Garrett said, his voice dropping an octave. This document appears to be fully compliant. It's a second will. It supersedes the one we have on file, and it includes detailed allegations of medical manipulation. Derek moved then. He slammed his hand onto the table, the wood groaning under his weight. This is a scam. She probably found some back alley lawyer to forge this. We're suing. We're taking everything. I didn't move. I stood at attention, watching him spiral. He was a man-child losing his toy, and the tantrum was exactly what I'd predicted. You can sue, I said, my voice cutting through his shouting like a knife through wet cardboard. But while you do, the police will be reviewing the medication logs Helen Briggs kept. They'll be looking at why my father was being pumped full of midazolam every time he tried to call his lawyer. It's called elder abuse, Derek. In this state, it carries a mandatory prison sentence. Vivian's mask didn't just crack, it shattered. She went pale, the color draining from her face until she looked like the ghost she'd tried to make me. She reached out, her hand trembling, as if trying to grab the papers back from Garrett. Richard loved me, she whispered. It was a pathetic sound. A lie she'd told herself so many times she actually believed the echoes. He loved the fortress, I said, and he realized you were the one tearing it down brick by brick. In the corner of the room, Paige finally looked up. She hadn't said a word since I walked in. Her eyes were red, her face sallow. She looked at her mother, then at the folder on the table. Vivian turned to her, her voice shrill and desperate. Paige, tell them. Tell them how happy he was. Tell them Millie is lying. Paige didn't look at me. She looked at the floorboards. Mom, maybe we should just let the lawyer look at the papers. Maybe we should just... Stop. Vivian's head snapped toward her daughter. The glare she gave Paige was pure venom. A predator realizing the smallest member of the pack was about to bolt. The internal breach had begun. The fortress wasn't just under siege, the walls were crumbling from the inside. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I'd delivered the payload. The explosion was inevitable now. I turned on my heel. I walked toward the door, my posture as straight as a steel rod. We aren't finished, Derek yelled at my back. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Actually, Derek, I said, my hand on the heavy brass handle. I'm just getting started. If you've ever watched someone smile to your face while they were picking your pockets, hit that like button right now. We've all dealt with a Vivian. Comment the word truth if you believe that no matter how deep you bury a lie, the light always finds a way in. Subscribe so you don't miss the next move in this campaign. I stepped out into the hallway. I didn't breathe a sigh of relief. I just checked my watch. The first battle was over, but I knew the enemy wouldn't retreat quietly. They were cornered rats now, and cornered rats always bite. I walked out to the parking lot, the cold Washington air filling my lungs. I got into the car and looked at the house on Miller Hill in the distance. The coordinates were set. The artillery was in place. The air at the Harlan Cemetery tasted like wet granite and pine needles. It was the kind of damp, bone-chilling cold that only hits the Pacific Northwest in early spring. I stood by the new headstone, my boots sinking slightly into the fresh mud. Richard Townsend. A man who spent his life selling people their futures but couldn't hold onto his own past. I didn't bring flowers. I don't believe in decorating a grave. But someone else had. At the base of the stone sat a wreath. It wasn't the polished, expensive kind Vivian would buy to show off to the neighbors. It was a messy, hand-woven circle of wildflower stems and thorny vine. It looked like it had been put together by someone whose hands were shaking. A small white card was tucked into the thorns. I'm sorry, Dad, it read. The handwriting belonged to Paige. It wasn't a tribute, it was a white flag. A total, unconditional surrender from the enemy's camp. I stared at the thorns for a long time. In the army, a soldier knows how to handle a surrender. You secure the perimeter. You process the prisoner. You don't get sentimental. But as the wind whistled through the cemetery oaks, I felt a hairline crack in the ice I'd spent 16 years building around my heart. Night came fast. I was back at the Harlan Motel, a low-slung building that smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial cleaner. The neon vacancy sign hummed outside my window, a jagged red buzz that made my teeth ache. I was sitting at the small laminate desk, my hands busy cleaning the brass on my uniform, a habit of discipline that kept my mind from drifting. A sharp, uneven knock hit the door. I didn't ask who it was. I didn't reach for a weapon. I just stood up, my back straight, and pulled the door open. Paige stood there. She looked like she'd been dragged through a briar patch. Her eyes were swollen, her hair was a mess under a damp wool coat, and she was shivering so hard I could hear her teeth rattle. In her arms, she clutched an old pine box, the one Richard used to keep on the corner of his desk. I didn't know, she whispered. Her voice was thin, like a wire about to snap. Mom said you left because you were heartless. She said you hated us. I believed her. I was the golden child. And I believed her. I didn't invite her in. I didn't offer her a chair. I just stood there, a major in the U.S. Army, watching a 30-year-old woman realize her mother was a monster. I took this from the office, Paige said, her voice cracking. Before Derek smashed the desk. He doesn't know. Mom doesn't know. She shoved the box toward me and stepped back into the rain. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just bowed her head and disappeared into the shadows of the parking lot. Her silence for 16 years was a crime, but handing over that box was a debt paid in full. I sat back down at the desk. The pine box smelled of dust and my father's old pipe tobacco. I opened the lid. Inside was the intelligence Vivian had tried to burn. A photo of me at 8 years old, missing a front tooth and wearing a lopsided ponytail. A single dried sprig of lavender, the last remnant of my mother's garden, and a stack of envelopes. They were cards, birthdays, Christmases, graduation. None of them had stamps. None of them had been mailed. Vivian had intercepted every single one before they could leave the house, but Richard had kept them anyway. At the bottom was a single sheet of yellowed legal pad paper. The ink was faded, the handwriting shaky and desperate. Millie, the letter started. The morning you left, I drove to the station. I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes because I was too afraid to face you. And by the time I worked up the courage, I was too late. I arrived at the Greyhound stop 20 minutes after the bus pulled out. I stood in the parking lot and watched the exhaust fumes fade into the hills. I cried. Millie. I sat in that car and I cried like a child. I was a coward. I was weak. I let her win because I didn't think I was worth fighting for. I'm sorry I was always late. I'm sorry I let the bus leave without me. I stared at the page. The major was gone. The officer was gone. There was just a girl in a cheap motel room holding a piece of paper that proved the last 16 years weren't based on a lack of love, but on a lack of strength. Richard hadn't abandoned me. He'd just arrived 20 minutes too late. I pulled the pine box to my chest. I didn't sob. I didn't wail. But the pressure in my chest finally broke. A single, hot tear hit the wood. The commander had left a final report, and for the first time since my mother died, I felt the wound start to close. He was weak. He was flawed. But he had never stopped loving me. The healing lasted for exactly 3 minutes. Then, the discipline returned. I looked at the lavender. I looked at the letter. The internal conflict was resolved. The tactical map was clear. I no longer had to wonder if I was fighting for a man who didn't want me. I was fighting for the man who had sat in a dusty parking lot and watched his world drive away because he was too broken to stop it. I stood up and walked to the closet. I pulled out my laptop. I didn't need Paige's hand-wringing or Vivian's fake tears. I had the truth. I opened the file for attorney Margaret Vance. My fingers hit the keys with a cold, mechanical precision. The ceasefire is over, I whispered to the empty room. The psychological baggage was gone. The internal war was won. Now it was time for the legal artillery to level the hills. Tomorrow, the no-contact phase was over. Tomorrow, I was going to strip Vivian of everything she'd stolen, brick by brick. I closed the pine box and locked it in my suitcase. I didn't sleep. I just waited for the sun to rise over Harlan. 11 weeks. That is how long it took for the legal gears to chew through Vivian's lies. 11 weeks of filings, depositions, and the kind of suffocating silence that only exists in a courthouse hallway. I didn't spend that time crying. I spent it in a motel room, folding my socks into perfect squares and studying the medication logs Helen Briggs had smuggled out like stolen ammunition. The mediation room at the Harlan County Courthouse was small and smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Margaret Vance sat next to me, her briefcase open, her eyes as cold as a mountain lake. Across from us, Vivian looked smaller. The black lace was gone, replaced by a beige suit that was supposed to look respectable, but just looked cheap under the flickering fluorescent lights. Garrett, her lawyer, was busy looking at his watch. He'd already seen the logs. He knew the ship was taking on water. Let's be clear, Margaret said. Her voice didn't waver. It was a surgical strike. We have the original logs from the night shift nurse. We have the affidavit from the attending psychiatrist in Bridgewater. Your client, Mrs. Marsh, systematically sedated Richard Townsend to procure a signature on a fraudulent will. That is not a civil dispute. That is a felony. Vivian didn't look at the papers. She looked at me. The honey was gone. The fake warmth had evaporated, leaving behind a face that was all sharp angles and bitter resentment. You always were a parasite, Millie, she hissed. Feeding off your father's guilt. You think this house is yours? You weren't even here when he died. You were playing soldier while I was changing his sheets. You were drugging him, Vivian, I said. My voice was a flat line. You weren't changing sheets. You were digging a grave. Garrett cleared his throat, a dry, nervous sound. My office is withdrawing from this matter due to unforeseen conflicts of interest. Good luck, Vivian. He didn't wait for her to answer. He grabbed his briefcase and walked out, the heavy door thudding shut behind him. That was the first domino. Derek didn't take it as quietly. He sat in the corner, his face flushed a deep, angry red, his breath coming in ragged hitches. He looked like he was about to burst out of his shirt. When Margaret slid the restraining order across the table, he didn't read it. He swept it onto the floor with a roar that echoed off the cinder block walls. You think a piece of paper stops me? Derek screamed. His spit hit the table. That's my house, my room. I've lived there for 16 years while you were hiding in the dirt in some desert. I'll burn that place to the ground before I let you step foot in it. Margaret didn't blink. She just looked at the court stenographer. Let the record reflect the threat of arson. Major, I believe we're finished here. The final ruling came 3 days later. A judge with a face like a bulldog banged his gavel, a sharp wooden crack that sounded like the end of the world. The second will was upheld. The house on Miller Hill was mine. Vivian was granted a pittance, a small monthly stipend that wouldn't even cover the lease on her minivan. She didn't scream this time. She just sat there, her hands trembling in her lap, watching her empire turn into dust. But Derek wasn't done. 02:45 hours. I was sitting in my car at the base of Miller Hill, watching the dark silhouette of the house against the moonlight. The rain was a steady gray curtain. Then I saw the flash of a flashlight in the upstairs window. My room. I didn't call for backup. I just drove up the gravel path, my tires crunching slowly so as not to announce my position. I stepped out of the car. The front door was hanging off its hinges, the wood splintered. Inside the house was a crime scene. The smell of cheap gin and sweat hit me first. Then, the sound of glass shattering. I walked into the parlor. Derek was there, a heavy iron crowbar in his hand. He'd already smashed the piano. The ivory keys were scattered across the floor like broken teeth. He was sobbing, a wet, pathetic sound, as he swung the bar into the drywall. It's mine, he shrieked, swinging the metal into the wall again. Thud. Crack. It's all mine. I didn't move. I stood in the doorway, my back straight, watching him unravel. He wasn't a man. He was a child who had been told no for the first time in his life, and the reality was killing him. The blue and red lights of the Harlan PD units flooded the room a moment later. They didn't have to be gentle. 3 officers tackled him into the debris, the sound of his head hitting the floorboards muffled by the drywall dust. They pulled his arms back, the silver handcuffs clicking into place with a final metallic snap. Get her off me, Derek yelled, his face pressed into the grit. She's trespassing. This is my house. The sheriff, a man I'd gone to school with, looked at me and shook his head. Sorry about this, Millie. We'll get him processed. He won't be seeing daylight for a while. They dragged him out, his boots scuffing against the porch, leaving a trail of white dust. The silence that followed was heavy. I stood alone in the ruins of the parlor. I looked at the hole Derek had punched in the wall near the fireplace. It was deep. It had gone through the lath and the plaster. I walked over to it. I reached my hand into the jagged opening, my fingers brushing against something that didn't feel like wood or stone. It felt like cold metal. I pulled. A chunk of drywall fell away, revealing a small, recessed cavity hidden behind the false wall Vivian had built 10 years ago. Inside was a heavy steel box, covered in 16 years of dust. My name was etched into the lid in my father's handwriting. The artillery strike had leveled the fortress, but underneath the rubble, the commander had left me one last piece of intelligence. The kitchen in the house on Miller Hill felt like a hollowed-out ribcage. Cold, empty. The smell of Derek's cheap gin had faded, replaced by the sharp, acidic scent of industrial bleach. I stood by the oak table, the same table where Richard used to drink his morning coffee and pretend everything was fine. Vivian sat across from me. She looked like a ghost that had stayed up too late. Her skin was the color of curdled milk, sagging around a mouth that had spent decades perfecting the art of the polite lie. She didn't have her pearls on today. She didn't have her dignity either. Outside, the Harlan County sky was a bruised purple. Derek was sitting in a holding cell downtown, waiting for a bail hearing that wasn't going to happen. Paige had packed her life into a rusted Honda Civic 3 days ago and crossed the state line into Oregon without saying goodbye. The Townsend empire had shrunk down to one bitter woman and a stack of legal papers. I slid the final transfer deed across the scarred wood. My hand was steady. My spine was a steel rod. I didn't feel the need to shout. I didn't feel the need to cry. I just felt the weight of the mission finally coming to an end. Vivian didn't look at the paper. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with the kind of practiced, watery sorrow that had probably worked on my father for 20 years. "I did it for the family, Millie," she whispered. Her voice was a dry rattle. "You don't understand what it was like back then. Richard was falling apart. I was terrified of losing the life he promised me. I was just a woman trying to keep a roof over our heads." I didn't blink. I watched a bead of sweat roll down her temple. She was playing the victim card, the final desperate play of a con artist who had run out of marks. "Fear didn't make you lock me in the basement, Vivian," I said. The words were flat, heavy, and cold. "Fear didn't make you forge a man's signature while he was so high on sedatives he couldn't remember his own name. That wasn't survival. That was malice, pure and simple." She opened her mouth to argue, a sharp retort dying on her lips as she saw my eyes. I wasn't her stepdaughter anymore. I was a major in the United States Army conducting a final inspection of a captured trench. "Sign the papers," I commanded. No heat, just the gravity of an order. "Pack your clothes, leave the keys on the counter. You have 2 hours before the sheriff returns to escort you off the property. If you're still here at 1600, you leave in handcuffs." Her hand shook as she reached for the pen. The sound of the nib scratching against the heavy bond paper was the only noise in the house. It sounded like a serrated blade cutting through dry leaves. Scritch, scritch. She signed. She stood up, her knees popping, and walked out of the kitchen without a word. I heard her heels clicking down the hallway, the sound of a retreat. 10 minutes later, a car door slammed. A gravel-spitting reverse. Then, silence. The house belonged to me now. But it wasn't the victory I had imagined when I was 18 and sleeping on a thin mattress in the dark. It just felt like a job finished. I walked into the parlor. The dust from the drywall Derek had smashed still hung in the air, dancing in the pale light of the evening. The hole in the wall near the fireplace looked like an open wound. I knelt in the debris. My fingers brushed against the cold steel of the box I had found earlier, but I didn't open it yet. My eyes were fixed on the cavity behind the studs, the space Vivian had hidden behind a layer of fake plaster and lies 10 years ago. Deep in the shadows of the wall, wedged between 2 cedar beams, was a frame. I pulled it out. The glass was shattered, a jagged diagonal crack running from the top left corner down to the bottom right. A parting gift from Derek's fist. But the photograph inside was still there. It was a wedding photo. Not Vivian and Richard. It was my mother, Grace, and my father. They were standing on the coast near Seattle. The wind was whipping my mother's hair across her face, and she was laughing, really laughing. My father looked young, his shoulders broad, his eyes clear of the fog that would eventually consume him. Vivian hadn't burned it. She had done something worse. She had entombed it. She had buried the evidence of a life before her, trying to erase the very foundation of who I was. I ran my thumb over the crack in the glass. The sharp edge sliced into my skin, a tiny bead of crimson blooming on the surface. I didn't flinch. The sting was real. The blood was real. The truth had been there all along, bricked up behind the vanity and the greed. Richard had kept it. Even when he was weak, even when he was losing his mind to the pills she fed him, he had kept this one piece of the past safe. I stood up, clutching the broken frame to my chest. I looked around the ruined room. The piano was smashed, the walls were torn. The family was gone. I walked to the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The Harlan air was crisp, smelling of rain and wood smoke. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed Margaret Vance's number. "It's done," I said. "What now, Major?" Margaret asked. I looked back at the hole in the wall, then down at the blood on my thumb. "Now," I said, my voice echoing into the dark woods of Miller Hill. "I start tearing down the rest of the walls." The air on Miller Hill finally shifted in June. The heavy, stagnant dampness of the rainy season had broken, replaced by a sharp, clean breeze carrying the scent of salt from the Puget Sound. I stood in the parlor of the house, watching a local contractor swing a sledgehammer into the last of the false drywall Vivian had installed. Crack, crash. Dust billowed, white and thick, coating my boots. I didn't cough. I just watched as the physical evidence of 16 years of deception crumbled onto the floorboards. Beneath the fake plaster, the original cedar beams remained, scarred but standing. "Take the whole wall down," I said. My voice didn't need to be loud. It carried the weight of a final directive. I spent the rest of the week clearing the debris of a dead era. I hired a tuner to fix the piano Derek had tried to shatter. The ivory keys were reattached, the internal wires tightened. When he hit the middle C, the note was clear, resonant, and true. It didn't sound like grief anymore, it sounded like a pulse. Outside the backyard was a construction site of a different kind. I spent 3 days on my knees, digging into the dirt where my mother's garden used to be. The soil was stubborn, packed hard with gravel and neglect. I turned it over with a rusted spade, my hands blistering, my back aching. I didn't stop until the earth was dark and soft again. I planted the seeds on a Tuesday morning. English lavender. I watched the soil settle over the tiny kernels of life. I wasn't just planting flowers, I was reclaiming the oxygen in this town. By noon, I had signed the first round of checks to reactivate the Richard Townsend Scholarship Fund. It wasn't going to be a vanity project for PTA mothers. It was a lifeline for the kids in Harlan who worked double shifts at the diner just to afford a textbook. Peace isn't something that just happens. You have to build it, brick by brick, just like a fortress. 2 months later, a letter arrived at my motel room. It was postmarked from Portland. I recognized the nervous, cramped handwriting on the envelope before I even saw the return address. Paige. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. The paper smelled like cigarette smoke and cheap motel soap. It was 4 pages of apologies, explanations, and tears dried onto the ink. She talked about the golden child trap. She talked about how Vivian had used her as a human shield. She asked for a chance to explain. I didn't read past the second page. I didn't need the data. I knew exactly who Paige was, a soldier who had deserted her post when the fire got too hot. I walked to the gas station across the street and bought a plain, blank postcard. I didn't sit down. I leaned against the rusted metal counter and wrote one sentence in the same block letters I used for mission reports. The door is always open, but no one is forcing you to walk through it. I dropped it into the blue USPS box. I felt the click of the metal flap, a final mechanical snap. Forgiving wasn't about her, it was about me. It was about cutting the last wire connecting me to the bomb Vivian had planted in my chest. I didn't move back to Harlan. I didn't want to live in a house haunted by the ghosts of people who had failed me. I kept my apartment in Seattle. I kept my rank. I kept my seat in the back of the bus, metaphorically speaking, always looking forward. The house on Miller Hill was no longer a tomb. It was a community center, a place for veterans, a place for the invisible people of the county to sit in the sun and drink coffee without being sedated or lied to. I drove back every Saturday. I'd pull the rental Nissan into the gravel driveway, roll down the window, and breathe in the smell of the new lavender. It was starting to purple the hillside, a stubborn, fragrant defiance against the gray Washington sky. Today is Tuesday, June 16th. I am sitting in my office at the base in Seattle. The light is cutting through the blinds, casting long, sharp shadows across my desk. I have a stack of supply manifests to approve and a training schedule to finalize. My life is built on order. It is built on the fact that I survived. I reach out and touch the frame on the corner of my desk. The glass is still cracked. The diagonal line Derek's fist left behind hasn't been fixed. I decided to keep it that way. Every time the sun hits it, the light refracts into a million tiny rainbows across the room. It's a reminder that a thing doesn't have to be perfect to be whole. My mother is laughing in the photo. My father is standing tall. The firepower of Vivian's greed had tried to burn them both into ash, but they had survived the cellar. They had survived the drywall. The mission was complete. The commander's orders had been followed to the letter. I looked at my reflection in the glass, my uniform sharp, my eyes clear. I wasn't the girl crying on the Greyhound bus anymore. I wasn't the victim of a house run by scavengers. I am Major Millie Davis. I have my name. I have my steel. And I have finally reclaimed the only territory that ever truly mattered. I stood up, adjusted my jacket, and walked toward the door. "Major," my sergeant said as I stepped into the hall. "Where to?" I looked at the horizon, where the mountains met the sea. "Forward," I said. "Always forward."